It happens in a fraction of a second. You're in a normal conversation, and then something shifts. A tone changes, a subtle jab lands, and suddenly your body reacts before your mind can catch up. Your chest tightens, your thoughts race, and you're left choosing between reacting and losing control, or staying silent and losing yourself. The Stoics understood this moment better than anyone. Marcus Aurelius believed that what truly defines you is not what others say, but how you respond. Because disrespect is not just an interaction, it's a test of your inner stability. So what if the real power isn't in saying more, but in saying the right thing with complete control? If these conversations speak to something real in you, something grounded in truth, philosophy, and inner growth, consider subscribing. It's a small gesture, but it helps us reach more minds like yours. And it quietly signals that you're walking this path with intention. It happens in a fraction of a second. You're in a conversation that feels completely normal, maybe even comfortable, and then something shifts in a way that's hard to explain but impossible to ignore. A tone changes, a word lands differently, a sentence carries an edge that wasn't there before, and suddenly you feel it in your body before you can even organize your thoughts. Your chest tightens, your mind speeds up, and a quiet pressure begins to build inside you, pushing you toward a reaction you've played out more times than you can count. You either fire back and try to regain control, or you shrink just enough to keep the moment from escalating. And even as it happens, you can feel that neither option truly belongs to you. One leaves you drained and regretful, the other leaves you silent and resentful, and somewhere in between those two extremes, you begin to realize that this is not just about a single moment, but about a pattern that has quietly shaped how you move through the world. Most people never stop to examine this pattern because it feels so automatic, so deeply wired into how we respond to discomfort, that questioning it seems almost unnecessary. But if you slow down just enough to look at it closely, you begin to see that what feels natural is not always what is true, and what feels instinctive is not always what is right. The Stoics understood this with a level of clarity that still feels almost unsettling today, because they refused to accept the idea that your peace should be dictated by someone else's behavior. Marcus Aurelius wrote to himself as a reminder that you have power over your mind, not outside events, and once you fully grasp what that means, something inside you begins to shift in a way that is subtle at first, but becomes undeniable over time. The shift does not happen because the world changes or because people suddenly become more respectful, but because you begin to see the moment differently. You begin to recognize that what you once experienced as an attack is often something else entirely, something far less personal and far more revealing of the other person than it is of you. When someone speaks with contempt or uses sarcasm to undermine you, it feels like they are evaluating you, measuring you, deciding something about your worth. But if you look more carefully, you start to notice that their behavior says more about their internal state than it does about your identity. People who are calm, grounded, and secure do not feel the need to diminish others in order to feel whole. And the ones who do often carry something unsettled within them, something unresolved that finds expression in subtle forms of disrespect. This is where the illusion begins to break. Because once you see that the moment is not truly about you, the emotional charge starts to lose its intensity. It does not disappear instantly, because the habit of taking things personally is deeply ingrained. But it begins to weaken just enough for you to create a small space between what happens and how you respond. That space is where everything changes, even if at first it feels almost invisible. It is the space that Epictetus spoke about when he said that it is not things themselves that disturb us, but our judgments about them. And while those words may seem simple on the surface, they carry a depth that only becomes clear when you begin to apply them in real moments. In that space, something unusual happens. the urgency to react starts to fade, not because you are suppressing it, but because you are no longer fully identified with it. You are observing it instead of being consumed by it, and that small shift creates a kind of quiet strength that does not need to prove itself. You are still aware of what was said, still aware of the tone, still aware of the tension in the room, but you are no longer pulled into it in the same way. You are no longer standing inside the moment, you are standing just outside of it. And from that position, you can see something that was previously hidden from you. You can see the pattern. You can see how certain people rely on reactions, how they test boundaries, how they push just enough to provoke something in return, and how most interactions are not about truth or clarity, but about control and energy. Once you begin to see this, it becomes harder to participate in it the way you used to, because you realize that reacting emotionally often means stepping into a game that was designed to pull you off-center. Carl Jung once said that until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate, and in moments like these, you begin to understand exactly what he meant. Because what once felt like an unavoidable reaction starts to reveal itself as a pattern that can be seen, understood, and eventually changed. But even with this awareness, there is still a challenge that most people struggle to overcome. The urge to explain, the urge to defend yourself, to clarify your intentions, to make sure the other person understands who you are and what you meant. It feels reasonable, even necessary, because part of you believes that if you can just communicate clearly enough, the tension will dissolve and the situation will resolve itself. But if you look honestly at your past experiences, you may begin to notice that this rarely happens the way you expect it to. Instead, it often creates more complexity, more misunderstanding, more opportunities for the conversation to drift away from what actually matters. You explain, they question. You clarify, they reinterpret. You try to bring things back to a place of understanding, and somehow you find yourself further away from it than when you started. This is not because you are wrong or because your intentions are unclear, but because you are trying to resolve something that is not rooted in logic, but in emotion and perception. This is where the deeper lesson begins to take shape. Because the Stoics were not concerned with being understood by everyone, they were concerned with being aligned with themselves. They understood that your sense of self cannot be built on the shifting opinions of others, because those opinions are influenced by factors you cannot control and often cannot even see. When you begin to internalize this, the need to explain starts to lose its urgency. You begin to see that not every misunderstanding needs to be corrected, not every judgment needs to be challenged, and not every moment requires a response. And then, in the middle of all this, something very simple emerges, a single sentence. It is not dramatic, not aggressive, not designed to impress or intimidate. It is quiet, precise, and almost disarmingly calm. But it carries a weight that is difficult to ignore because it does something most responses fail to do. It shifts the focus away from you and places it exactly where it belongs. You look at the person, not with anger, not with defensiveness, but with a kind of steady awareness that feels grounded and unshaken. You allow a brief pause, just long enough to create a sense of presence, and then you say in a calm and neutral voice, "Are you hoping for a reaction from me?" There is something powerful about this question that goes beyond the words themselves. It does not attack, it does not accuse, it does not escalate, but it reveals. It brings the underlying dynamic of the interaction into the open, and in doing so, it removes the subtle layer of ambiguity that often allows these moments to continue unchecked. When you ask this question, you are not defending yourself. You are observing the situation, and that distinction changes everything, because now the attention shifts. The person who initiated the disrespect is no longer operating in the background of the interaction. They are now at the center of it. Their intention, whether conscious or not, has been brought into focus. and they are forced to confront it in a way they may not have anticipated. This can create a moment of hesitation, a pause where the usual pattern is interrupted, and in that pause, the dynamic begins to change. But what matters just as much as the question itself is what follows it. Silence. Not the kind of silence that feels awkward or uncertain, but the kind that feels intentional and grounded. The kind that does not rush to fill the space, does not try to soften the moment, does not move to explain or justify. It simply remains, and in that stillness, something remarkable begins to happen. The other person starts to feel the weight of their own words. They may try to laugh it off, to dismiss it as a joke, to redirect the conversation, but the energy has already shifted. The usual flow has been disrupted, and they are now navigating a space that they did not expect to enter. This is where your composure becomes your strength, because you are not trying to control their reaction, you are simply allowing the moment to unfold without stepping back into the old pattern. Over time, as you continue to practice this approach, something deeper begins to take root. You start to feel less dependent on the outcome of these interactions, whether the other person understands, whether they change their behavior, whether the conversation resolves in a way that feels satisfying. These things begin to matter less. Not because you have become indifferent, but because you have become grounded in something that is not easily shaken. This is what the Stoics referred to as the inner citadel, a place within you that remains steady regardless of external circumstances. It is not built through a single moment or a single realization, but through consistent practice, through repeated choices to remain aligned with your values, even when it would be easier to react or retreat. It is built through the quiet discipline of observing your thoughts, questioning your assumptions, and choosing your responses with intention. And as this inner stability grows, you begin to notice changes that extend beyond these moments of disrespect. You become less reactive in general, less influenced by the shifting moods and opinions of others, more focused on what truly matters to you. You start to move through the world with a different kind of presence, one that is not easily pulled in different directions, one that does not need to prove itself constantly. At the same time, you may also begin to notice that not everyone responds positively to this change. Some people may feel uncomfortable, some may interpret your calmness as distance, some may even view it as arrogance. This is where another layer of understanding becomes important, because part of this path involves accepting that you cannot control how others perceive you. You cannot ensure that everyone will understand your intentions, and you cannot prevent others from forming their own narratives about your behavior. Carl Jung spoke about the shadow, the parts of ourselves that we project onto others, and in many ways, how people respond to your boundaries often reflects more about their own internal world than it does about you. When you stop reacting in the way they expect, you disrupt not only the interaction, but also the assumptions they have built around it. This can create resistance, but it also creates clarity, because it reveals which relationships are built on mutual respect and which are sustained by patterns that no longer serve you. And this is where the final shift begins to take place. You stop trying to manage how you are perceived, and you start focusing on how you live. You stop chasing validation, and you start building integrity. You stop reacting to every external trigger, and you start responding from a place that feels steady and deliberate. This is not something that happens overnight, and it is not something that requires perfection. There will still be moments where you feel the pull of old habits, moments where you react more quickly than you would like, moments where you replay interactions and wish you had handled them differently. But even in those moments, there is progress, because awareness has already changed the way you see things. And once you see something clearly, you cannot unsee it. So the next time you find yourself in that familiar moment, when something shifts and you feel the old pattern beginning to take hold, remember that you are not limited to the choices you have made in the past. You can pause, You can step back. You can choose a response that aligns with who you are becoming, not who you used to be. You can look at the situation with clarity, recognize what is actually happening beneath the surface, and respond in a way that reflects your own sense of balance and control. And when you begin to respond from that place, not from impulse and not from pressure, but from clarity that you have built slowly through awareness, you start to notice something that most people move through life without ever fully understanding, and that is the fact that the moment itself begins to lose its power over you in a way that feels both subtle and profound at the same time. This shift does not happen because people suddenly change their behavior or because the world becomes more respectful or fair, but because your relationship to these moments transforms at the root, and what once felt like something happening directly to you begins to feel like something you are observing with distance and understanding, something that passes through your awareness rather than something that defines your state or your identity. If you stay with this long enough, if you continue to observe instead of react, you begin to see that the pain you once felt so intensely was never only about the words themselves, but about the meaning you attached to those words and the silent story you created around them, a story that often included doubt, insecurity, and the quiet fear that maybe in some hidden way what was said could reflect something true about you. That fear is what gave those moments their weight, and that fear is what kept you engaged in patterns of reaction and explanation that never truly brought you peace. But as your awareness deepens and your understanding becomes more grounded, that fear starts to dissolve, not because you convince yourself that you are beyond criticism, but because you begin to build something far more stable than external validation. Something that does not depend on how others see you or speak to you. This is where the internal shift becomes undeniable, because instead of looking outward for confirmation, you begin to turn inward with a level of honesty that most people avoid, and you start to evaluate yourself based on your own actions, your own discipline, and your own alignment with what you believe is right. In this process, you are not trying to become perfect, and you are not trying to remove all flaws, but you are building a relationship with yourself that is rooted in truth rather than perception. Carl Jung spoke about this when he said that the privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are, and what he meant by that becomes clearer in moments like these, because becoming who you truly are requires you to detach from the need to constantly adjust yourself in response to the expectations, judgments, and reactions of others. As this understanding settles within you, you begin to see that most people are not reacting to you as a person, but to their perception of you. And that perception is shaped by their own experiences, their own insecurities, and their own unresolved conflicts, which means it is often incomplete and sometimes entirely inaccurate. When you fully accept this, you stop trying to manage how you are seen in every interaction, and instead you start focusing on how you live, how you act, and how you carry yourself, regardless of how it may be interpreted. This shift does not make you indifferent or disconnected, but it makes you grounded in a way that allows you to remain steady even when the environment around you is not. There is a noticeable difference between reacting and responding, and as you continue to practice this awareness, that difference becomes more defined in your daily interactions. Reacting is immediate and driven by emotion, often pulling you into patterns that you later question or regret, while responding is deliberate and rooted in observation, allowing you to choose your actions based on your values rather than your impulses. This is the discipline that the Stoics practiced consistently, not as a theory, but as a way of living, and it is what allowed them to remain composed in situations that would overwhelm most people. Marcus Aurelius reminded himself repeatedly that other people act according to their own nature, not according to your expectations. And when you truly understand this, you stop being surprised by behavior that once unsettled you, and you stop expecting clarity, respect, or stability from those who have not cultivated it within themselves. This understanding does not mean that you tolerate everything or that you accept disrespect without boundaries, but it means that your response is no longer driven by the need to correct or confront every situation. Instead, your response becomes more intentional, more measured, and more aligned with your internal state rather than the external trigger. And this is where another layer begins to reveal itself, because it is not only about what you do in the moment, but also about what you do after the moment has passed. The way you adjust your behavior, the way you shift your attention, and the way you decide who continues to have access to your time and your energy becomes a quiet but powerful form of communication. You do not need to announce these changes or explain them in detail because they are expressed through your actions rather than your words. You begin to engage less with those who show a pattern of disrespect. You offer less of your energy in spaces where it is not valued, and you become more selective about where you invest your attention. This is not done out of resentment or withdrawal, but out of clarity, because once someone has shown you how they operate, you are no longer guessing or hoping for a different outcome. You are responding to what has already been revealed. As you continue to move in this way, you may notice that some people respond differently to you and not always in a positive way. Some may feel uncomfortable with your calmness, some may interpret your distance as arrogance, and some may attempt to provoke you further in order to regain the dynamic they are used to. This is where it becomes important to understand that you cannot control how others perceive you, and that trying to manage every interpretation is a path that leads back to the same patterns you are working to move beyond. Carl Jung spoke about projection and the way people attribute their own internal states to others, and when you observe this closely, you begin to see that much of what people say about you reflects more about them than it does about you. This realization allows you to let go of the need to be understood by everyone, which is one of the most difficult but liberating steps in this process. You begin to accept that your life is not a performance designed to gain approval, but a process of living in alignment with your own values, regardless of how it is perceived. This does not isolate you, but it frees you from the constant pressure to adjust yourself in order to maintain acceptance, and it allows you to build connections that are based on mutual respect rather than unspoken expectations. As this way of thinking becomes more natural to you, you begin to notice that your responses become simpler and more precise. You no longer feel the need to explain yourself at length. You no longer feel the urge to defend every misunderstanding, and you no longer react to every perceived slight. Instead, you move with a sense of clarity that allows you to see situations for what they are without adding unnecessary complexity to them. You begin to understand that not every moment requires your engagement, and that sometimes the most powerful response is simply not to participate in the pattern at all. This brings you back to the moment where everything begins, the moment where something shifts and you feel the familiar pull to react. But now, instead of being pulled into that reaction automatically, you recognize it as it arises. You create a small space between the trigger and your response, and in that space, you choose how you want to engage. You observe the situation without immediately assigning meaning to it, and you allow yourself to respond from a place that feels steady and intentional. And when you choose to speak, you return to that single sentence that carries more weight than it appears to on the surface. A sentence that does not escalate the situation, but reveals it. You look at the person with calm awareness, you allow a brief pause to create presence, and you ask, "Are you hoping for a reaction from me?" This question does not attack or accuse, but it shifts the focus in a way that brings the underlying dynamic into the open, and it removes the ambiguity that often allows these moments to continue without being addressed. What follows is just as important as the question itself, because the silence that comes after is where the real shift takes place. This silence is not uncertain or uncomfortable, but intentional and grounded. and it allows the other person to confront the weight of their own words without being guided by your reaction. In that silence, the usual pattern is interrupted, and the dynamic begins to change in a way that does not require force or argument. Over time, as you continue to practice this approach, you begin to experience a level of stability that is not easily disturbed by external events. You become less reactive, more observant, and more aligned with your own sense of self. And this alignment becomes the foundation from which you respond to the world. This is not a fixed state that you achieve once and maintain without effort, but an ongoing practice that requires awareness, reflection, and a willingness to continue learning from each interaction. There will still be moments where you feel the pull of old habits, where you react more quickly than you would like, or where you find yourself caught in patterns that you thought you had moved beyond. But even in those moments, there is progress, because your awareness has already changed the way you see things, and once you see something clearly, you cannot return to the same level of unconscious reaction. So the next time you find yourself in that familiar moment, when something shifts and you feel the pressure to respond in the way you always have, remember that you are not limited to those patterns. You can pause, you can observe, and you can choose a response that reflects who you are becoming rather than who you have been. You can recognize that the moment is not necessarily about you, that the behavior of the other person reflects something within them, and that your response is an opportunity to reinforce your own stability. And in that moment, you can say the one sentence that brings everything into focus, and then allow the silence to carry the rest, because in that silence you are no longer reacting to the situation, you are shaping it, and that is where true control begins. And as you continue to move through life with this awareness, something even deeper begins to take shape, something that is not immediately visible but gradually becomes the foundation of how you experience everything around you. You start to realize that these moments of perceived disrespect were never isolated incidents, but reflections of a broader pattern that extends into nearly every interaction you have ever had, a pattern where your internal state was constantly being negotiated by external forces, where your sense of balance depended on how others behaved, spoke, or reacted to you. And once you begin to see this clearly, you understand that what you are really changing is not just how you respond to a single comment or a single person, but how you relate to the world as a whole. This realization can feel both empowering and unsettling at the same time, because it reveals how much of your emotional life may have been shaped by habits that you never consciously chose. It shows you how often you have adjusted yourself in subtle ways to maintain harmony, to avoid conflict, or to protect your image, and how those adjustments, while they may have seemed necessary in the moment, have slowly pulled you away from a more grounded and authentic way of being. But rather than seeing this as something negative, it becomes an opportunity. Because awareness does not condemn you for the past, it gives you the ability to move differently in the present. As this awareness deepens, you begin to notice that your sensitivity to these moments starts to change. What once felt sharp and overwhelming begins to feel more distant, more manageable, and sometimes even neutral. This does not mean that you become numb or disconnected, but that your emotional responses are no longer dictated by every external fluctuation. You begin to feel a sense of stability that comes not from controlling your environment, but from understanding your own mind in a way that allows you to remain steady regardless of what unfolds around you. This kind of stability is not something that most people cultivate because it requires a level of patience and honesty that is often uncomfortable. It requires you to look at your own reactions without immediately justifying them, to question the stories you tell yourself about what others say or do, and to recognize the ways in which your perception shapes your experience. Carl Jung spoke about this process as a form of integration, where you bring awareness to the parts of yourself that operate unconsciously, and in doing so, You reduce their influence over your behavior. When you apply this to moments of disrespect, you begin to see how much of your reaction was not about the present moment, but about past experiences, past fears, and past conditioning that had never been fully examined. And as you begin to separate the present from the past, something shifts in a way that feels almost like relief. You are no longer carrying the full weight of every previous experience into each new interaction. You are meeting the moment as it is, rather than as a continuation of everything that came before it. This allows you to respond with a level of clarity that was not available to you before, because you are no longer reacting to a layered history of unresolved emotions, but to the situation in front of you. This clarity also changes the way you see other people, because you begin to recognize that just as your reactions were shaped by your own experiences, theirs are shaped by theirs. You start to see behavior not as something personal, but as something patterned, something that reflects deeper processes that are often invisible on the surface. This does not mean that you excuse harmful behavior or that you ignore boundaries, but it means that you no longer take everything as a direct statement about your worth. You begin to understand that much of what people express outwardly is a reflection of what they are dealing with internally, and this understanding creates a kind of distance that allows you to remain composed without becoming indifferent. At the same time, this awareness begins to refine your sense of responsibility. You start to see more clearly what belongs to you and what does not. You recognize that you are responsible for your actions, your responses, and your choices, but not for the emotions, interpretations, or behaviors of others. This distinction is crucial because it frees you from the constant pressure to manage situations that are not within your control, and it allows you to focus your energy on what truly matters, which is how you choose to show up in each moment. This shift in focus has a profound effect on your daily life because it simplifies things that once felt complicated. You no longer feel the need to analyze every interaction in detail, to replay conversations in your mind, or to search for the perfect response after the moment has passed. Instead, you trust the process you are building, the awareness you are developing, and the stability you are cultivating within yourself. This trust does not come from certainty about every situation, but from confidence in your ability to handle whatever arises without losing your center. And as this confidence grows, you begin to notice that your presence itself starts to change the way others interact with you. Not because you are trying to influence them, but because you are no longer participating in the same patterns. When you do not react in expected ways, when you do not engage in unnecessary explanations, when you do not mirror the emotional intensity of the situation, you create a different kind of environment, one that is less reactive and more grounded. Some people will adjust to this, some will respect it, and some will find it difficult to engage with, but regardless of their response, you remain consistent in your approach. This consistency becomes one of your greatest strengths because it reflects a level of internal alignment that is not easily disrupted. You are no longer adapting your behavior based on the immediate demands of each interaction, but acting from a place that remains steady across different situations. This does not make you rigid or unresponsive, but it gives you a foundation that allows you to navigate complexity without being overwhelmed by it. As you continue to build this way of being, you begin to understand that true self-respect is not something that is declared, but something that is demonstrated through your actions over time. It is reflected in the way you handle difficult moments, in the boundaries you maintain without needing to justify them, and in the choices you make about where you invest your energy. It is not about proving anything to others, but about being consistent with yourself in a way that builds trust internally. And this internal trust is what ultimately replaces the need for external validation. When you trust your own judgment, your own values, and your own responses, you are no longer dependent on others to confirm your worth. This does not mean that you ignore feedback or that you isolate yourself from meaningful connections, but it means that your sense of self is not easily shaken by the opinions or behaviors of others. You become more open to genuine interaction because you are no longer guarding yourself against every possible threat, and more selective about where you place your attention because you recognize its value. In this state, the sentence you use in moments of disrespect becomes less about defense and more about clarity. When you ask, "Are you hoping for a reaction from me?" you are not just interrupting the immediate interaction, you are expressing a deeper understanding of what is happening beneath the surface. You are acknowledging the pattern without participating in it, and you are doing so in a way that remains calm and composed. The silence that follows is not empty, but full of intention, and it allows the moment to unfold without being driven by reaction. Over time, these small but consistent choices begin to shape your experience in ways that extend far beyond individual interactions. You find yourself less affected by things that once felt significant, more focused on what truly matters, and more capable of maintaining your balance in situations that would have previously unsettled you. This does not mean that challenges disappear, but that your relationship to them changes in a way that allows you to move through them with greater ease. And perhaps the most important realization that emerges from all of this is that the power you were seeking in these moments was never in controlling others, but in understanding yourself. It was in recognizing the patterns that shaped your reactions, in creating space between stimulus and response, and in choosing to act from a place that reflects your values rather than your impulses. This is not a destination, but a process, one that continues to evolve as you deepen your awareness and refine your understanding. So as you move forward, carry this awareness with you, not as a rigid rule, but as a flexible guide that helps you navigate the complexity of human interaction. Remember that you have the ability to pause, to observe, and to choose, even when the moment feels intense or uncertain. Remember that not everything requires your reaction, and that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is to remain steady in the presence of disruption. And when you find yourself in that familiar moment, when something shifts and you feel the old pattern beginning to rise, return to that space you have learned to create. Allow yourself to step back just enough to see clearly, to understand what is happening beneath the surface, and to respond in a way that reflects who you are becoming. There comes a moment in your life when you realize that peace is not something you find, it's something you protect, not with force, not with words, but with awareness. And once you learn to stand in that awareness, to choose your responses instead of being ruled by them, you begin to move differently. You begin to live differently. You begin to become someone the world cannot easily shake. So carry this with you, not as an idea, but as a practice. In the quiet moments, in difficult conversations, in the seconds where everything tries to pull you out of yourself, stay grounded. Stay aware, and choose who you are again and again. If this spoke to something real in you, then don't stop here. There's another video on the screen right now that will take you even deeper into mastering your mind and protecting your inner peace. Watch it and keep building that part of yourself most people never touch. And truly, thank you for being here, for taking this time, and for being a part of Psychresto Mind.